Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along. And I guess, I guess the true thank you comes to you for not just putting some time aside this afternoon, but for putting the work in that you do with students who you might describe as being at the pointy end. I felt even a little uncomfortable preparing a webinar today called the pointy end. It sounds a little bit like you're trying to label these kids when you refer to them in some way, and by collectively putting a little blanket over them, like being the pointy end students. But I guess I ran with it because it is a reference that I hear so regularly in the work that I do with schools, and so because I hear it, I thought, if I title the webinar "The Pointy End," then people will pretty much know what I'm talking about. I guess where I come from is a position that, while a student might be considered in your school or in your class a pointy end student, is that my ambition is that one day they wouldn't be, that they would be a student whose behaviours have slowly, gradually, progressively, over time, started to change the label for themselves, and that they start to live up to a better label for themselves. And as much as sometimes it's not aspirational to be back in the pack, that's kind of what we want for these guys sometimes, is for their behaviours to be much more aligned with the more regularly experienced learning behaviours that most kids come to school with. So when we are talking about the pointy end, I am referring to students, probably our top 3 to 5% of students. So for most classroom teachers, that means that we're talking about 1, maybe 2 students in your class or your home group who need some sort of individual intervention to happen, for whom the regular strategies, the regular classroom management plan that you might have in place, or even just the collective set of classroom management practices that you deploy, just don't get them the traction that they're looking for, or perhaps they just don't hit the mark, or perhaps they just don't fulfill a current or pressing need for that student. And we can continue with our frustration. And I know that for a lot of the teachers that I work with who battle with pointy end students, sometimes they use the metaphor or the simile that it's like bashing my head against a brick wall, and it feels a little bit like it by the end of the year, that you've spent a significant amount of time beating your head against a brick wall. Now, there are 2 things that we need to understand about that expression. Number one is that it's probably not true, and that most of the teachers that I work with who struggle along for the whole year are so good-hearted and so fervent about deploying good strategy wherever they possibly can, that they do make ground with the students. They just don't recognise it. And 2 is that I just love you to get that sense of progress. So it's really important that we shift strategy from maybe sometimes what we can just conjure from our own experience, and actually stop occasionally and say, okay, I need to learn something new. And that's what you've decided to do as a result of coming along to this webinar today. So congratulations, not only for the work you do, but for the investment that you're making in yourself today. Welcome. And I hope that today we can provide you an experience that will allow you to get that all-important traction and progress that I've referenced there. I guess what I'd like to do is to begin by letting you know where I come from here. And I was thinking about how because I do contend that when most people look to begin the journey, to tackle the task of, and we hear that similarly sometimes about how to that riddle about how do you eat an elephant, and it's one bite at a time. And when we commence to take our first bite, I would contend that a lot of the time we take our first steps or our first bite in the wrong direction, because we're thinking about what we're going to do to this kid or what we're going to do for this kid. And the truth is, what we need to do to be able to make sure our strategy is taking us in the right direction is to first of all come from a position of understanding of what's going on. So I want to say first of all that I come from a position of understanding in terms of an educator trying to work with a pointy end student. It's not easy. It's not easy, and we feel a lot of embarrassment, guilt and shame with not getting anywhere with these students sometimes. And so I want to say that I get that. I understand that. I've felt all of that myself, and that sometimes when we're experiencing guilt and shame and embarrassment, that we don't always come up with the best strategy. So I commend you, as like I said, on coming along to the webinar, and I want to encourage you to just try to park some of that and try to let some of that go, so that you can let the neocortex of your brain come on and to think a little bit. But I also want to emphasise that I come from a position of understanding in terms of the students. Um, no student gets up in the morning and says, you know what, I want to go to school today and cause mischief. I want to make people sad. I want to make people feel threatened. I want to be angry. And these are often the kinds of affects and characteristics that we experience when we're working with these students, but it's unintentional. So what I think is really important for us is to put the lens on that whenever we are working with these students, that we're looking to understand what's going on, and that means that what we start to do is to give these kids what they need rather than what they deserve. And it's very true that these are the students that least deserve our love and our regard, but they are certainly the students who need it the most. So I come from a position today of not how are we going to correct these students, not how are we going to manage these students, but I come from a position today where I'm saying that what we need to do is to better understand these students. If we do, I think that you can come up with some really clever contextual strategy at your school level. Therefore, what I'm not going to give you today is these are the 7 steps for dealing with a pointy end kid, because there is no poster child pointy end kid. They are all outrageously different. And what we need to do is to be able to have a strong understanding of the way that human behaviour works. If we can have a better understanding of the processes that we need to put in place in schools, and perhaps how well the current processes that we're using in schools are working. And if we can match those two together, then I think that you'll come up with something pretty clever that can help you move forward. I want to emphasise too here before we move on with the webinar that there's a couple of things that you can do. I guess first of all, what I want to point out is that I'm going to cover a large and difficult topic very quickly, and therefore I just want you to relax and enjoy the webinar today. I don't want you to feel like you've got to take copious notes. We are going to send you a recording of the webinar today. We'll record this and we'll put it up on YouTube, and you'll get a link to that to be able to watch it again. So I want you to have this webinar as a resource for you, your class, and your school as you move forward. So I want you to relax and understand that what I'll also do at the end of the webinar is show you a couple of ways that you could interact with us at Real Schools if it's something that appeals to you. Got a couple of resources as well that I'd love to be able to flick your way if that's of interest to you as we get cracking on this really important task. The other thing I want to remind you as we move forward about today is the control panel that you can see on your screen as you're experiencing the webinar today. And I guess maybe the wrong word there is experiencing, because what I'd like you to do is to participate in the webinar today. We're going to give you the opportunity to participate in some polls in just a minute, but there's a couple of other ways that you can get involved in the webinar that are worth knowing too. You can use the question box. So if you have a question about the content here, I always make a point of emphasising that if you've got a question about your pointy end student, and I would suggest not using a name, but I suggest also being on the other side, on the flip of that, being incredibly clear about what you're experiencing. I think that it's probably going to be of benefit to other people who are in our little webinar classroom today. So I encourage you to step up and pop a question in there. I'll keep a little eye out on that question box from time to time. If you are for some reason experiencing any technological difficulties with the webinar today, our wonderful business manager Chris is always online. She's a bit of a whiz with this stuff. If you can't hear me, if you can't see the screen or anything like that, there's usually something simple, and if it's not, it's something simple that I've messed up, and she'll correct one or the both of us and get us back on track. You can also, if you have a look at your control panel, you'll see a little button that looks like a palm of a hand, and you're able to put your hand up during the webinar. So I'm going to keep a little eye out on the attendance sheet here, and if you put your hand up, I can unmute you from wherever you are, and you can ask a verbal question in the webinar. It can be a little bit more nimble, a little bit more agile to be able to unmute you and hear your question rather than go backwards and forwards through the question box. But I guess if you are feeling shy, feel free to type it. So there we are. Let's get cracking. I guess for me, what I'd like to to be able to contextualise this in some way is that I'd love to know where you're at in terms of how you come to the webinar today. So a couple of polls just to really just to help me to be able to make sense of things today. I'm just going to select a poll and get this first one going. In terms of you at the coalface, I'd really just like to know what your position is when it comes to being at the coalface. We often talk about these are the kids that we need to get our hands dirty with, and that's where that notion of the coalface was conjured for me. So I'm hoping you'd be able to put in here, just let me know where you come from today, because I'd love to be able to adjust a little bit to make sure that I'm hitting the mark. I know that this is a topic that so many people invest in, that it's worthwhile me knowing, and I can see a pretty clear theme emerging here, that it's worthwhile me having a really clear understanding of who you are in this room today. And I like to get the voting up above 80%. We're nearly there, so there's just a couple of you who haven't voted. There we go. I think we just got creeped over the top now. So what I might do is just close that poll. I'll share those results with you so you can see who's in the room today. I can see we've got a lot of people in that leadership position today, but we've also got a fair cohort, about a third of the people in the room by the looks of it, who are at the coalface in terms of being in the classroom with these students. So that's really useful for me to know. Thank you so much for that. I might just, if it's okay with all of you, ask one more question, and it's just, I guess I'm interested in what's your motivation, what are you searching for today? So I might just launch one more poll here to find out what it exactly is you're looking to get out of this. Now, I won't read through all of those. I'll give you just a moment to have a look at them. But I guess what I'm trying to find out is, are you looking to help other people or yourself? Are you looking for specific strategies? Why don't you try this? I think that can be a little fraught sometimes. And I guess what I'm interested in is whether you're looking for a replicable way of going about working with Pointy End students, so you haven't just got one person in mind, but perhaps others. Or perhaps is it that you're looking for a methodology that matches purpose? I think that what a lot of people get concerned about is whether they're deploying something that is so unique for these students that they actually abandon their purpose or their values in working with young people. So that's why I put that fifth one in there as well. So I'll give you just a couple more seconds to get your vote in. I can see that we've just gone past 70% now, so creeping up towards that 80% mark that I covered. If you could whack yours in there. Very interesting. Okay. I might end it there just for the process of moving forward. I'll share those results as well with you so you can see. So I can see there that a lot of people have latched onto that fifth one of a behaviour improvement methodology. And I'm really happy to explore that with you today about the notion of, can we start to get our heads right about the thinking that's required in order to make traction with these students? We can definitely work on that together. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate your participation there. So what I want to do today is to get into, I guess there's three things for me from a thinking perspective that we need to do, and then four things that are a little more concrete, that are a little more strategic about the way that we need to work. So it's about the thinking we need to have in place. Are we pointing the ship in the correct direction before we move? And then I want to start look at four different steps that you could take in terms of being able to get some of that traction. And the first here is to understand, I have, I guess, a golden rule, and to explain where this golden rule came from around human behaviour. I had a wonderful opportunity many years ago to work in the Northern Territory coordinating behaviour and wellbeing across the NT, and it's true that there are some rather interesting and often indescribable behaviours that are happening in some of the far-flung corners of the Northern Territory for a variety of different reasons. And what I realised was that I was coming at my schools with advice from a very implicit framework, and that means that it was really just coming from my own experience and my own ideas. And I was doing a lot of, why don't you just try this, which I think is, for somebody who lands in an advisory position without having to experience it day to day, I think that's quite unfair. So I realised that I needed to be more explicit and have a wider base of understanding for upon which my advice could stand credibly. So I did a lot of reading and read a lot about constructivist theories around behaviour. I read a lot about applied behaviour analysis. I read a lot about, I looked into approaches that I'm an advocate for to this day, like restorative practices. And I guess I looked for themes. I looked for things that stood out in all of the literature that would be accessible to teachers. Because what I was mindful of is that no classroom teacher is going to go and read all of the books and watch all the videos and scour through all of the papers that I was, because my role was quite unique. They've got other things that they need to spend their time on, like trying to survive their pointy end kids. I came up in the end with something that really has stood the test of time for me over, probably in the last couple of decades, and that is that every behaviour has a meaning and a context. That's my golden rule. Number one is that the behaviour has a meaning in that it serves a purpose for that young person in the short term and or the long term. It doesn't look sometimes like there's any rhyme or reason to that behaviour, but most behaviours, and one of the common frames we hear from people, is a young person who's trying to get, avoid or achieve something. So if we think about the early childhood student who throws themselves on the ground and rolls under a table and kicks and screams and bites ankles and does all of those things because you asked them to do something horrible and torturous, like count. It's usually, most people, given that small brief of information, will say that that's a young person out of those three options, get, avoid and achieve, who's looking to avoid. They're looking, and that's nothing to do with the behaviour. So sometimes we go into how could I stop them from being violent under the table? What we need to do is to realise that the meaning that sits behind that behaviour is it's an avoidance strategy for counting. They're feeling shame and they're feeling embarrassment around having to count because they haven't yet achieved that. And they've learned that whenever you experience something, and they've learned in a way that often has come from other behavioural contexts, such as their home, that if you experience something that might embarrass you or make you feel a bit of shame, what you do is you wreck the whole thing and you lose the plot a little bit and roll under the table. And what do you know? You don't have to count when you do that. Now, it doesn't happen in quite the conscious methodology like that, but it's almost a Pavlov's dog's response to that affect being experienced in the limbic system of their brain. So they leap to that conclusion very quickly whenever they feel that affect. But if we can know what that's all about, then we can get in behind the actual behaviour to the motivation of the behaviour, and we can do something about it. Every behaviour is a young person trying to get, avoid or achieve something. And if we can think about what it is that they're trying to get, what it is that they're trying to avoid, or what it is they're trying to achieve, then we go part of the way to being able to understand what that behaviour is all about. When we understand, we devise good strategy. You can realise, that's what this is all about. And all of a sudden, you're not dealing with the consequences of the behaviour, but you're starting to deal more with the causes of the behaviour, which can be a far more effective way to work. And the second half of that equation, that every behaviour has a meaning and a context, is that context part. And for me, I think that we underestimate very regularly as educators the incredible control we have over context. We have almost no control over many factors in our young people's lives. And the truth is, when it comes to our pointy end students, they often have some significant stuff that has either happened or is going on in their lives, and you just can't do anything about it. It's going to happen whether you like it or not, and regardless of what you do or not. But what we do have amazing control over is the context that they walk into when they get to school. And if you could start to establish a context that gives them a better chance of succeeding, then I think that you're onto something. So what it's about is think about where that student is seated. Think about where you are positioning yourself when you're working with a student. If you've got a student who you think may have hearing difficulties, then let's start to manipulate the context so that the gaps are lessened as a result of where they're seated in the classroom and where you deliver your instruction from. If we want to have a classroom where students collaborate more effectively, then we need to fix our classroom structure so that the students aren't sitting in rows facing the front, because it's very difficult to collaborate that way. And what I want you to understand about context is that young people adjust their behaviour according to context from about the age of about 2.5. they start to adjust. This is where, you know, little toddlers will cling onto mum's leg when a stranger walks into the room because the context has changed. Whereas earlier, before that, the behaviour will be what it is no matter what. And so, you know, I know that from one of my stories from a very young age. I remember my daughter having her 3rd birthday party, and she was the context of the party changed her behaviour. She was on show. You know, there were, you know, nibblies and drinks being handed out to everybody present, and there were pleases and thank yous, and these were 2 words that we weren't aware that she was capable of until the party started. And everybody left the party, and they looked past my wife Anthea, looked to my wife Anthea and I as they left, and they said to us, "It must be a pleasure to raise a girl like Ebony." And we said, "Yes, thank you," through gritted teeth. And for then the context would change. The guests were gone, and Anthea would look at me and say, "How long do you think we've got?" And I'd say maybe about 30 or 40 seconds before the next tantrum hits because she wasn't allowed her 17th piece of fairy bread. Context matters. And if we can start to build a context where your students, particularly our Pointy end students, walk in and feel safe, where they feel comfortable, where they feel like achievement is the hallmark of this context. Because when I mentioned before the kid who goes bananas because they had to count, they have experienced failure in the learning environment. It's a very negative affect that drives negative behaviour. And in fact, there's a lot of literature and research that says that poor student behaviour choices are sometimes can be attributable at a rate of around 80% to a sense of academic failure. So what we need to do is to create environments where these kids are going to succeed. A lot of these students often work with a learning support assistant, and they get this really well. They understand that, you know, sometimes these kids read a word that was really tough and they get it right, but they haven't realized they got it right, and they sort of paused ready to be corrected because it was a long word, but they have it right. And the LSA will look at them and say, you know, no, that's right. And this is the only thing that motivates them to read more, is the fact that they got something right. So we need to build contexts that give them a chance, that give them an opportunity to succeed, and to seize that immense opportunity that we have over context. The second thing I want to talk to you about is common behaviour motivators. I would suggest that there are 4. There are 4 that I've noticed in classrooms that are hugely important to understand when it comes to why kids do certain things. The first one I would suggest is rescue. I think that a lot of young people, when they're faced with difficulty, hit the excuse button, or they hit the helplessness button, and they say, "It's too hard, I don't get it." You know, and they're the kids that are task resistors. They won't even start tasks, even if they're tasks that you know they can do, because they're worried that at some stage during the task you're going to make it slightly more difficult and they're going to experience failure again. And they've learned that they need to get themselves out of environments that are challenging, not to seek them or to, you know, thrive in them or to actually, you know, look forward to them. So it's really important with these students that we ask them to unpack in more detail, "It's too hard." When they're seeking rescue, what we want to do is to have them just water it down, that notion of rescue, into the notion of looking for support rather than rescue. So that means you might ask them, you know, when they say it's too hard, just like, "Could you tell me specifically which part of this is too hard?" And you've just got them into now having a look at the work, and they're looking for support now rather than for you to bail them out on even the easiest part of the work. Rescue is where we need someone else to do all the work for us. You know, this is when you're bobbing around in the ocean, you know, shipwrecked. You do not need the helicopter hovering above you trying to give you a swimming lesson. "I need to be bailed out. I need you to do all the work. Throw me the lifebuoy, pull me up. You know, get me out of here." But not all situations that are difficult and challenging in life require me being rescued. A lot of them do just require a bit of support. So get them to ask you, ask those students for a smart question. Ask them how much help they would need. Ask them which part of it is your job and which part of it's my job, and allow them to start to step in to achieve something in the task, so that they don't always seek the opportunity for you to bail them out completely. The second motivator that I find commonly sits behind behaviour is attention. So, and that's probably no surprise to you. A lot of these students, who we would call pointy end students, seek the spotlight, and we often refer to them as being attention seekers. The trick around attention seeking behaviour is to not feed the beast. Now, that means that I tend sometimes to make this sound like what you need to do if a student is is seeking attention is to ignore them. Sometimes, as you know, that can inflame the situation and they will step up because they need some sort of payoff for it. The best, I guess, little metaphor that I've heard from a wonderful colleague I know has worked with some students who have significant behaviour challenges, is he says what you need to do, well, the way we need to view attention is currency. It's the payoff for the behaviour that they are exhibiting. And so he says that what you need to keep in mind is that if they go to $1 worth of effort, that the best strategy provides them with 5 cents of reward. It's not completely ignoring, because that seems kind of rude and I get affronted and I tend to behave worse in that moment, but you give them something, but they're just not enough. So a friend of mine, he had a year 11 student come in and start to attach clothes pegs to his face. And he thought, oh, gee, do I ignore this? But you see, that it wasn't working because all the other students were looking. So he went, right, how do I get 5 cents of attention? And he went and stood next to him and he just said, you know, nice impression of the paddle pop line, mate, but I've got these beautiful people I've got to teach maths to today. And then he kept working. The clever thing that he did for this student was, after the class, he said, hey, stop, come here. And the kid thought he was going to get in a bit of trouble with the teacher. And he just said, what's going on? And they engaged in a really interesting conversation about how he was feeling bored in maths, about how he was struggling at home a bit, and, found out a few things that he really needed to know to get him back on track. And they made some agreements about the way that they would work together in the future afterwards. Had a really good chat. He said what he didn't want to do was ignore him totally, because that would compromise the relationship. But what he wanted to do was to understand that he needed to give him a little bit of a payoff when he was demonstrating the wrong behaviour. And then when he demonstrated the right behaviour, like sitting down and having a mature conversation, he wanted to give him his absolutely full undivided attention. That's going for 5 cents worth of effort, but getting $1 worth of return. It's not terrible for kids who are motivated by attention to seek our regard. We just want them to seek regard using the right behaviours. So keep that one in mind. The third behavioural motivator that's worth referencing is power. Many students are motivated by power. Their favourite motto would probably be, you can't make me, you're not my mother, and it's a dare. They're trying to dare you into an argument, into a battle. The thing we get wrong with those students is that we think that when they invite us into battle that we have to win. And the kid is not trying to win. They're just so motivated by having the fight that they will pay a price for it. So we can be threatening detentions until they're 25 years old and they're still telling us to get stuffed and, try it on, see if you can make me. The penalty is enormous, but they're still playing because the motivation to have control over our behaviour, to have that power, is so strong. We need to get off the battlefield when we're working with those students. We need to say to them, you're right, I can't make you, but I care so much about your learning that I'll give you the help at recess if you need it, and walk right away. Get off the battlefield and frame your expectation as support. Even better if you can frame it as care. Kids who are motivated by power often really don't like it when you demonstrate your deep and sincere care for them publicly. And my advice is, do it. If they do their work just so that you won't come over and care on them in front of everybody again, then I reckon that's happy days. And the third motivator behind behaviour is a random one. It's pain. And these are students who often are experiencing trauma. And I guess what I want to do is just encourage you that sometimes we need to stop being teachers when we're dealing with kids who we might even figuratively or even realistically describe as being damaged. We need to stop being teachers and start for a moment to just be agents. Can we think, are we accessing these kids or even their parents and their families to the help that they need? Could we point them in the right direction? Can we get them some of the social or the psychological or even the medical assistance that they need to be able to get past barriers in their lives that are truly behind the behaviour that you're experiencing? Classroom strategy alone won't cut it with kids who are damaged. We need to get them help, and sometimes there's no one else helping them apart from their homeroom or their classroom teacher if it may be a primary school. So keep that in mind, that sometimes it's not just up to you to strategize your way out of this, but to get the background help required to help them move forward. The third thing I guess I want you to keep in mind is a very simple model around behaviour that can help when you talk about methodology, a lot of behaviours could be described in terms of a very basic ABC, and that is that there's an antecedent, so there's an event that impacts us in some way. Any event can be positive or negative. You know, a kiss on the cheek from my wife as I walk out the door puts me in a good mood. You know, it just has me in, you know, I drive to school in a better mood, I drive to work in a better mood as a result of that peck on the cheek. But a harsh word from her sends me to school, sends me to work in a different mindset. But I might get there and demonstrate a certain behaviour, and there'll be a consequence for that behaviour afterwards. And that consequence, whatever it is an event, just like an antecedent, and in fact becomes the antecedent for the next behaviour. So you can see here that what happens with the human condition is that we're constantly spiralling around from an antecedent, something that happens, we demonstrate a behaviour, and there's a consequence for that behaviour that becomes the antecedent for the next behaviour. So we're spiralling very regularly in terms of positives and negatives, because if we start with a negative antecedent, such as a harsh word from my wife, I might do the wrong thing, and then someone else says something harsh to me, and I feel and think something negative as well, and then tend to be that my next behaviour is negative. But if it's positive, if we can intervene at the positive end with an antecedent, I tend to go and do positive things. People give me positive feedback, and then I move forward. What I wanted you to think about here in terms of this model, in terms of antecedent behaviour and consequence, is where do we normally step in a school? Where is our intervention? Where does our intervention most regularly occur? Now, when I ask that to people, the most common answer they give me is around here. We intervene or we enter in somewhere between the behaviour and the application of a consequence for a behaviour. And I would contend to you that often that's entirely too late. So what we need to do is to think about how could we create, before a negative behaviour happens with our student who we might describe as being pointy end, how could we be the positive antecedent in their life? Many teachers know this in a very implicit or informal way, because we really do know that often with these students, when they walk in on a Monday morning, we have to ask them how their football match or how their birthday party went over the weekend before we can expect them to do anything that resembles learning or work. So we create a nice little positive environment. We try to leverage that feeling for moving forward. It's good strategy. It's good strategy. If we can be a little bit more explicit about it, a little bit more routine and ritualized about it, then what happens is these kids start to come into the environment. No matter what, they're always experiencing something positive at the start. Something positive at the start can lead to a likelihood of a more positive behaviour, the likelihood of a more positive consequence, which becomes the antecedent for the next behaviour. We get a positive spiral, or an upward spiral, if you will, in terms of their behaviour. But we've got to decide that we're going to move that yellow starburst north. We're going to take it out of the gap between the behaviour and the consequence, and we are going to do a lot of our work in the antecedent place so that we can actually get in behind that behaviour and create the conditions for a higher likelihood of positivity. Just realising that I'm perhaps left you with the results there from a survey. I do apologise for that. So moving from thinking about that ABC model and getting in earlier in it is an incredibly important thing to do. I apologise. I'm not quite sure if I did that there, but we'll soldier on regardless. So three thinking frames there for you to keep in place. The golden rule: every behaviour has a meaning and a consequence. Understanding those common behavioural motivators around attention, around rescue, around power, and around pain. And also then understanding this thinking model in terms of ABC, getting in earlier than we might as our normal process of practice. When we start to get strategic, what I'd like you to do first of all is to narrow your focus. It is utterly true that human beings tend to improve behaviours successfully by being able to focus on them one at a time. Yet what we often expect of our students who are experiencing behaviour challenge is for them to improve all of the behaviours we're concerned about or irritated by quickly and in clumps. And we don't like to improve behaviour in clumps, even in the most trusting relationships that we have. So if you were to think for a second even about about, I know that if I were to think about my best friend, so if my best mate Marty were to come along and sit down with me and say, hey Adam, we need to have a little bit of a chat, I'd go, yeah, of course, Marty, no worries, what do you want to talk about? He says, mate, I think there's a couple of things you need to fix up. I think you need to spend more time at home and stop getting out with your work and seeing your friends and things like that. I think you need to not swear as much. I think you need to cook more meals with your family. I think you need to walk the dog more. I think you definitely need to get fitter. I think you need to stop watching so much reality television. And I think you need to occasionally, make a bit of a bigger effort for Anthea so that she feels valued in the home. But by about the time Marty's getting to the second or third behaviour, in my head, if I may speak colloquially, I'm thinking, get stuffed, Marty. And the main reason is that if I try, I know that even when I've got the support of somebody who I trust implicitly, if I try to solve 7 or 8 behaviours in my life at once, I will fail at all of them. We need to, as a really clever fellow called Darren Hill suggests, start with what he calls content behaviours that are wildly specific. Now, we know that we're narrow, because if I were to walk into your classroom and ask your pointy end student what behaviour it is that they're working on at the moment, if they can't answer me, then we haven't got narrow enough. If they're saying things that are broad, like being good, then I know that we haven't got narrow enough. If Marty comes along and says to me, hey mate, I'm thinking that you and I should get a bit fitter. Do you want to join a gym together? Kind of interested in that. The support and accountability that sits around a singular behaviour makes me feel like I've got a chance to succeed, and that's exactly what your students are looking for. So hugely important that we narrow our focus. It's hard because there are often so many things about this student that we're looking to get better at. The good news for you, even though this now feels like we're about to break it down into a series of infinite number of challenges, the good news is that the old metaphor about a rising tide lifts all ships stands very true. And what that means is that once you start to get success with a certain behaviour, other behaviours tend to get swept up in it. And some behaviours either improve or they also are eliminated when the gap, the vacuum of negative behaviours in this kid's life, once those behaviours start to get addressed, when they get replaced with positives, things can start to snowball very quickly in the right direction. So what we're looking for here is to get started by really narrowing in, by really saying, okay, what's the one thing that we want to get better at as we move forward? The second thing that I want you to do from a strategic point of view is get clear about your individual behaviour plan strategy. Now, whatever your acronym is here for building a behaviour plan, I do come to this with a sense of frustration about the way we work with these students. I think that there are many schools that are trying to improve behaviour through an individual learning plan when it's actually the behaviour that's getting in the way of the learning. So why not deal with the cause rather than the symptom? I do also contend that far too many individual behaviour plans are tackling the list of all those behaviours that we want that student to do, we want that student to improve. And what we need to do is to use a plan that genuinely targets a specific behaviour. And I think that too many of these behaviour plans are wish lists, aspirations, and what they also speak to is what we're going to do. Basically, they're a strategy list of things that we're going to do when the student fails. So what we want to do is to step away from that. The behaviour plan that we advocate has been built and in the theory of applied behaviour analysis, and it's also been one that has stood the test of time for me. I haven't used anything different than this over about the last 15 years or so. It's a simple plan, and what it does is it narrows our focus down to a specific behaviour and sets a student up for success. The way that I guess the key component that sits within this, and I won't unpack this too far because our individual behaviour plan template is something that's a completely different webinar that you can, if you're a Real Schools member, then you can go and check that out in the member section. But the plan is very much built around 3 things. What you need to do is to develop a very clear target behaviour, as I've just spoken to. You need to have a measure of improvement. And so we actually need to be clear about what the scoreboard says. How many times will this kid need to demonstrate this behaviour or not demonstrate this behaviour in order for us to go thumbs up that success? And then what's the reward for it going to be? Now, I could go into a lengthy discussion here around extrinsic versus intrinsic rewards. Extrinsic rewards, to give you the nutshell, the way that I view it in a nutshell, extrinsic rewards are fantastic for bringing a target behaviour to attention, terrible for keeping it there. We'll need intrinsic rewards in order for us to be able to keep that behaviour happening as a matter of habit. But in terms of getting started, extrinsic rewards can be really valuable. The way that rewards work best is if you can tailor them. Yet the way that we use rewards often in our schools is frightfully generic. So we'll say to a kid, if you get this right, you're going to have 30 minutes of computer time, because that's the reward that I'm used to rolling out. And the kids go, oh yeah, fair enough, but they're not really excited about it. An exciting reward is one that really has them go, I really say that anytime we let a kid know about a reward that we're looking to put in place for an extrinsic reward for a behaviour, it needs to be the sort of reward that has them look at us sideways when they go, no way, really? So, an example of that for me would be, we had a student that I worked with many years ago who was obsessed by the WWE, by the wrestling. And so we went to a local newsagent just down the road, and we said, look, we saw that you sell these wrestling magazines. And he said, yeah, we do. We keep them on the shelf. We get rid of a few of them from time to time. I said, do you ever not sell them? And he said, yeah, all the time. I said, the ones you don't sell that go out of date, could we have them? And he said, yeah, fine. And we got them for free, so it didn't cost us anything. But for us to put the reward of, you will get this WWE magazine with all its posters that you can pull out and put up in your room if you hit this target for us, was an incredible motivator. It had this kid go, no way, really? What was it about the reward that had him go, no way? It was the fact it was tailored. It was tailored to his unique strengths and interests. So 3 steps: target behaviour. Secondly, a measure of improvement, the scoreboard. We all love progress. And thirdly, it's how we can connect it to their individual strengths and interests that really matters. When you get your email after the webinar today, which will have the recording and the opportunity to sign up for the next webinar as well. If you'd like to reply to that webinar asking for our individual behaviour plan template, you can see the one page of the really basic instructional guide, and we'll send you the Word version as well, so you can start typing into it as well. Then feel free to reply to that email, and we'll make sure that we get that across to you. So there's a little offer that we've thrown in there today as well. Step 3 strategically that I'd like you to do is to map for success, not failure. So what we often do when we're looking to try and get somewhere with the student is we put in place a new expectation of that student. Sometimes we don't think about the teacher responsibility here, about what's the work that we would need to do in order for them to be successful. We just put the expectation in place and go, let's hope for the best. So what I would suggest we need to do is to say, anytime we're going to put a new expectation or a new strategy in place, what we need to do is to think about what is the teacher responsibility here that would give them the best chance of succeeding. High support, high expectation in place here. I would also suggest that too often we go, rightio, expectation of student, and this is a really simple map that you could use. There's 6 lines, 6 rows, if you will, on this map. So you might say a new expectation every 2 months. Across 12 months, we're looking to get something in place. But what we often do is go, right, I'm targeting this behaviour. I'm going to jump in here with expectation number 1, and this is what's going to happen. And this is, okay, I'll think about something that I'm going to do. And we sort of rush because we're keen for improvement to happen quickly. I want to suggest that before you start to jump to strategy, that you stop and think, have I checked for rapport and relationship first? Do I have enough relationship in place that I can leverage it for a high level of performance? The litmus test that you might like to run across your relationship with the student is, would they feel disappointed if they didn't reach the required standard? Would they not want to let me down? And if not, then you might want to say, teacher responsibility. This needs to be something active that we're really going to do. It's not try harder to get to know the kid, because what does that mean? It needs to be binary. It needs to be something we did or we didn't. And I used to call a business lunch, which meant that I used to think, okay, if I've got a student who sees the world, even for instance, through a veil of anger, what's the best? I always think restoratively in the way that I work. The first principle of a fair process is engagement. So I'm going to engage that kid. What's the best way to engage them? It would be away from negative peer influences. Good. So I need to get them one-on-one. What's the best bait for getting them away from their friends and into my company one-on-one? I reckon it's food. And so a bit like a fish, the best bait is you put the best bait you can think of on the end of a hook and hope they bite. And for many of the kids that I've worked with, if I need to get them engaged so that I can start to improve their behaviour, it's going to cost me a sausage roll. So I'll go and buy a sausage roll and I'll say, hey, let's have lunch. And it's not because I've done anything wrong. It's just because I am building that rapport and relationship such that my strategy, when I get around to it, has a chance of improving. The second thing that I think is really important is to share the problem and plot together. If you just say to a student, hey, I've noticed this going on a bit lately. What do you reckon? Yeah, I know. And I've been messing up a bit. Yeah, it's probably not about messing up, but that's all right. Yeah, I can see what you're talking about. What do you reckon we do about it? How do you reckon we should come up with a plan together? We should come up with a plan. So for me, that often involved, if I was going to work restoratively with the student, is that, I would let them know that here's the questions I'm going to ask you. Let's take the anxiety out of it. I always say to people that I think that the most common cause of anxiety is the absence of a plan. It's not knowing what's going to happen next. So I would hand the student the restorative question cards, not just hope they'll answer them when things go wrong, but I would hand them the cards, talk to them about it. Do you understand what these questions mean? Do you get that I'm never going to abandon that every single time something goes wrong, that's all we're going to do? And yeah, cool, okay. And they've got agreement about that. Now, if my relationship's in place and we've got a plan that removes the anxiety, now we can talk strategy. Implement whatever it is, the strategy that whatever the target is that we're looking to improve. So I want you to really keep that one in mind. And the last thing I want you to keep in mind from probably a strategic / thinking point of view, is the notion that we are not looking for miracles here. We are looking at any behaviour improvement strategy, and I think far too many really good behaviour improvement strategies in schools get thrown out because the kid made a mistake again. Now, we're not looking for the eradication of a behaviour because we wrote a plan or we implemented a strategy. I mean, that's just, just such an unrealistic bar that we set for ourselves. What we need to do if we want to improve behaviour is improve both frequency and severity. We need the behaviour to happen a little less often and a little less bad. And if we can look back, even when the student, again, makes a mistake in their behaviour and gets it wrong, if we can look back on our strategy and go, you know what, are we getting somewhere though? Is it happening not quite as much? And when it does happen, is it happening not quite so severely? Then we could go, actually, we're getting somewhere. This is a good strategy. This is just a blip on the radar. This is an aberration. Sporting coaches are really good at this. Really good teams, when they lose a game, they don't overreact. They just go, we think this is probably a bit of an aberration. We'll learn something from it. But mostly we're tracking pretty good, and they truck on, and they're successful. The reason for me putting the KFC picture up there is pretty simple. With my line of work, I have a target in my life that seems to be perennial. It seems to be forever on my radar, and that is that I would like to drop 10 kilo. I'm going to do the Kokoda track soon for a bit of a bucket list thing that I'd like to do, and really thought I really need to carry a little less weight around the track as I go. And I'm starting to think that even with that motivation, I'm not quite going to get there, because you see, I travel a lot in my work, and sometimes it's difficult to eat right, and in particular, I'm not a fan of plain food. And if I land back in Melbourne after visiting one of my schools and it's 11 o'clock at night and I haven't had dinner because I didn't like the aeroplane food, sometimes I'm driving home, and in the distance I see these 3 letters and that red facade on the building, and that smiling face, almost calling me. I see his lips move sometimes, going, come in, Adam, come in, Adam. And I hit that drive-through. And the truth is that just because I went through the drive-through at KFC shouldn't mean that my ambition to be 10 kilogram lighter is over. Just because I messed up doesn't mean I need to stop trying, or that my strategy isn't in some way, is completely flawed in some way. What we need is for me to just go to KFC a little less often. And when I do go, we just need me to not order the family feast when I go through drive-through. Frequency and severity, they're the things that we're after when we're looking to improve behaviour. So thank you. I hope that those 3 thinking frames, and I hope that those 4 strategic imperatives are useful to you as you move forward in terms of helping those pointy end kids. In terms of next steps, one of the things that we've provided for you today is the slide deck from today. So if you have enjoyed the webinar today and would like to be able to refer to that again, we really want you to be able to just have that for free. So please look in your control panel at the handout section. And you'll see that there's a PDF sitting there, and there are all the slides from today. We'd love you to have those and to use those as a resource moving forward. And I guess the other thing is that we've been able to help so many schools, through our partnerships and our memberships with them to bring this kind of resource to them. If you would like to have a chat about that for your school, then please jump on board. We were delighted to just this week add Remain Park Primary School in Tasmania to our list of partner schools. We're going to be working with them for the next 3 years on this kind of work, but also a whole lot more in a whole variety of different ways. And if you'd like us to follow up by just flicking you a line and arranging a time for a 10-minute chat to find out whether that could be worthwhile for your school, then please pop that in that box. The other thing I want to bring to you here is I want to do an ad. So bear with me. Don't clog right out of the webinar because there's an ad you need to hear. A good friend of mine, Donna McGeorge, is probably someone who I would rate as probably Australia's leading authority when it comes to how people should collaborate and the way that collaboration should connect to productivity. Donna's latest book that she's releasing at the moment is the 25-minute meeting. When I read it, I thought that is the book that's going out to all of my partner schools every semester. We send a book out to our partner school principals so that they've got something to read that's a little bit outside the edu bubble. And Donna has so graciously offered to run our next webinar. So on Thursday, the 16th of August at our usual time of 3:30 p.m, Donna's going to run a webinar on making meetings matter. I was completely convinced I would get myself tongue-tied around that title, but I've somehow managed to navigate that successfully. We're going to send you the link so that you can register immediately for that. And I don't know, how do I sell this more effectively to you? I think you'd be nuts. I think you'd be completely nuts if you didn't come along to this webinar and hear some of Donna's wisdom. As you can tell from her picture, she's not a boring person. She's just so full of life, Donna, and so full of practical, useful, and easy to implement strategy that I think you're gonna love this one, basically. All right, checked my question box. I think that nobody's done anything there. I think that all you scaredy cats have kept your hands down through the webinar, but I do hope that today's been a useful experience for you. If you'd like to get in touch with us, this is how you do it. Enjoy the next month. Enjoy embarking upon semester 2. And we'll see you for Donna McGeorge with Making Meetings Matter in August. I did it twice. Yay. See you next time.